Okay, today we're going to be reading chapters 12 and 13 of A Long Walk to Water. And chapter 12, as usual, starts off with Naya, but it is now Southern Sudan 2009. It was 2008 when we started the story. An iron giraffe, a red giraffe that made very loud noises. The giraffe was a tall drill that had been brought to the village by the two men who had visited earlier. They had returned with a crew of 10 more men and 2 trucks, one hauling the giraffe drill along with other mysterious equipment, and the other loaded with plastic pipe. Meanwhile, the land was still being cleared. Naya's mother tied the baby on her back and walked with several other women to a place between the village and the pond. They collected piles of rocks and stones and tied them up into bundles using sturdy cloth. They balanced the bundles on their heads, walked back to the drilling site, and emptied the rocks on the ground. Other villagers, using tools borrowed from the visitors, pounded the rocks to break them up into gravel. Many loads of gravel would be needed. Naya didn't know why. The piles of gravel grew larger each day. The clangor of machinery and hammer greeted Naya each time she returned from the pond, unfamiliar noises that mingled with the voices of men shouting and women singing. It was the sound of people working hard together, but it did not sound at all like water. What is the red giraffe? And why does Naya describe it this way? Well, it was a very tall drill that had been brought into her village, and she described it that way because she had never seen anything like this and had nothing to compare it to other than it was really tall like a giraffe. Question 2, what are the villagers doing and how do they feel about this work? Well, they are collecting rocks and stones, and then they are breaking it up into gravel. And if the other villagers are like Naya, they don't really know why they're doing this work. They don't really know. But they're doing it because it was asked of them, and they were shouting and singing, working hard, so it sounds like they were willing to work. Okay, so now we're in the Itang refugee camp in Ethiopia in 1985. Back to Salva. Mother, please. Salva opened his mouth to call out again, but the words did not come. Instead, he closed his mouth, lowered his head, and turned away. The woman in the orange headscarf was not his mother. He knew this for certain, even though she was still far away and he had not seen her face. Uncle's words came back to him. The village of Lunarik was attacked, burned. Few people survived. No one knows where they are now. In the moment, before calling out to the woman a second time, Salva realized what Uncle had truly meant, something Salva had known in his heart for a long time. His family was gone. They had been killed by bullets or bombs, starvation or sickness. It did not matter how. What mattered was that Salva was on his own now. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of a giant hole, a hole filled with the black despair of nothingness. I am alone now. I am all that is left of my family. His father, who had sent Salva to school, brought him treats like mangoes, trusted him to take care of the herd. His mother, always ready with food and milk and a soft hand to stroke Salva's head. His brothers and sisters, whom he had laughed with and played with and looked after. He would never see them again. How can I go on without them? How can I not go on? They would want me to survive, to grow up and make something of my life, to honor their memories. What was it that Uncle had said during the first terrible day in the desert? Do you see that group of bushes? You need only to walk as far as those bushes. Uncle had helped him get through the desert that way, bit by bit, one step at a time. Perhaps Salva could get through life at the camp in the same way. I need only to get through the rest of this day, he told himself, this day and no other. If someone had told Salva that he would live in the camp for 6 years, he never would have believed it. So the next section is 6 years later in July of 1991. They're going to close the camp. Everyone will have to leave. That's impossible. Where will we go? That's what they're saying, not just this camp, all of them. Excuse me. The rumors skittered around the camp. Everyone was uneasy. As the days went by, the uneasiness grew into fear. Salva was almost 17 years old now, a young man. He tried to learn what he could about the rumors by talking to the aid workers in the camp. They told him that the Ethiopian government was near collapse. The refugee camps were run by foreign aid groups, but it was the government that permitted them to operate. If the government fell, what would the new rulers do about the camps? When that question was answered, no one was ready. One rainy morning, as Salva walked toward the school tent, long lines of trucks were arriving. Masses of armed soldiers poured out of the trucks and ordered everyone to leave. The orders were not just to leave the camp, but to leave Ethiopia. Immediately, there was chaos. It was as if the people ceased to be people and instead became an enormous herd of panicked, stampeding, two-legged creatures. Salva was caught up in the surge. His feet barely touched the ground as he was swept along by the crowd of thousands of people running and screaming. The rain, which was falling in torrents, added to the uproar. The soldiers fired their guns into the air and chased the people away from the camp. But once they were beyond the area surrounding the camp, the soldiers continued to drive them onward, shouting and shooting. As he dashed ahead, Salva heard snatches of talk. The river! They're chasing us toward the river. Salva knew which river they meant, the Gilo River, which was along the border between Ethiopia and Sudan. They are driving us back to Sudan, Salva thought. They will force us to cross the river. It was the rainy season. Swollen by the rains, the Gilo's current would be merciless. The Gilo was well known for something else, too. Crocodiles. Okay, the rest of the chapter questions. Number 3, what does the orange scarf woman force Salva to admit to himself? How does he continue to go on despite the black despair of nothingness he is feeling? Well, he's finally forced to admit to himself that his family is really gone, that they've died at some point. He doesn't know how, but he continues to go on because he knows they would want him to honor their memories. They would want him to make something of his life. Number 4, how long did Salva stay in Itang? 6 years. And 5, why did he leave? Well, the Ethiopian government changed, and the soldiers forced the people out of the camp. Chapter 13 returns to Naya in southern Sudan, 2009. Naya thought it was funny. You had to have water to find water. Water had to be flowing constantly into the borehole to keep the drill running smoothly. The crew drove to the pond and back several times a day. The pond water was piped into what looked like a giant plastic bag, a bag big enough to fill the entire bed of the truck. The bag sprang a leak. The leak had to be patched. The patch sprang a leak. The crew patched the patch. Then the bag sprang another leak. The drilling could not go on. The drilling crew was discouraged by the leaks. They wanted to stop working, but their boss kept them going. All the workers wore the same blue coveralls. Still, Naya could tell who was the boss. He was one of the 2 men who had first come to the village. The other man seemed to be his main assistant. The boss would encourage the workers and laugh and joke with them. If that didn't work, he would talk to them earnestly and try to persuade them. And if that didn't work, he would get angry. He didn't get angry very often. He kept working and kept the others working too. They patched the bag again, and the drilling went on. Number 1, how did the boss handle the drilling crew when the bag kept springing leaks? And what character trait does this show? Well, he kept them going. He would encourage them. He would laugh and joke with them. And I want you to think for yourself what character trait that might be in him. Okay, now on to Salva. We are in Ethiopia, Sudan, Kenya, 1991 to 1992. And so if you remember back to our map at the beginning, we knew that Ethiopia was not where he ended up because of the map. And so he's been here in Itang for a very long time, for 6 years. And now he's going to cross the Gilo River. That takes him through the corner of Sudan and then down into Kenya. And that's where we're headed now. Hundreds of people lined the riverbank. The soldiers were forcing some of them into the water, prodding them with their rifle butts, shooting into the air. Other people, afraid of the soldiers and their guns, were leaping into the water on their own. They were immediately swept downstream by the powerful current. As Salva crouched on the bank and watched, a young man near him plunged into the water. The current carried him swiftly downstream, but he was also making a little progress across the river. Then Salva saw the telltale flick of a crocodile's tail as it flopped into the water near the young man. Moments later, the man's head jerked oddly, once, twice. His mouth was open. Perhaps he was screaming, but Salva could not hear him over the din of the crowd and the rain. A moment later, the man was pulled under, and a cloud of red stained the water. The rain was still pouring down, and now bullets were pouring down as well. The soldiers started shooting into the river, aiming their guns at people who were trying to get across. Why? Why are they shooting at us? Salva had no choice. He jumped into the water and began to swim. A boy next to him grabbed him around the neck and clung to him tightly. Salva was forced under the surface without time to take more than a quick, shallow breath. Salva struggled, kicking, clawing. He's holding on to me too hard. I can't. Air. No air left. Suddenly the boy's grip loosened and Salva launched himself upward. He threw his head back and took a huge gulp of air. For a few moments he could do nothing but gasp and choke. When his vision cleared, he saw why the boy had let go. He was floating with his head down, blood streaming from a bullet hole in the back of his neck. Stunned, Salva realized that being forced under the water had probably saved his life. But there was no time to marvel over this. More crocodiles were launching themselves off the banks. The rain, the mad current, the bullets, the crocodiles, the welter of arms and legs, the screams, the blood. He had to get across somehow. Salva did not know how long he was in the water. It felt like hours. It felt like years. When at last the tips of his toes touched mud, he forced his limbs to make swimming motions one last time. He crawled onto the riverbank and collapsed, and then he lay there in the mud, choking and sobbing for breath. Later he would learn that at least 1,000 people had died trying to cross the river that day, drowned or shot or attacked by crocodiles. How was it that he was not one of the 1,000? Why was he one of the lucky ones? The walking began again. Walking, but to where? No one knew anything for sure. Where was Salva supposed to go? Not home. There is still war everywhere in Sudan. Not back to Ethiopia. The soldiers would shoot us. Kenya. There are supposed to be refugee camps in Kenya. Salva made up his mind. He would walk south to Kenya. He did not know what he would find once he got there, but it seemed to be his best choice. Crowds of other boys followed him. Nobody talked about it, but by the end of the first day, Salva had become the leader of a group of about 1,500 boys. Some were as young as 5 years old. Those smallest boys reminded Salva of his brother Kuhl, but then he had an astounding thought. Kuhl isn't that age anymore. He is a teenager now. Salva found that he could only think of his brothers and sisters as they were when he had last seen them, not as they would be now. They were traveling through a part of Sudan still plagued by war. The fighting and bombing were worse during the day, so Salva decided that the group should hide when the sun shone and do their walking at night. But in the darkness it was hard to be sure they were headed in the right direction. Sometimes the boys traveled for days only to realize that they had gone in a huge circle. This happened so many times that Salva lost count. They met other groups of boys while walking south. Every group had stories of terrible peril. Boys who'd been hurt or killed by bullets or bombs, attacked by wild animals, or left behind because they were too weak or sick to catch up. When Salva heard the stories, he thought of Mariel. He felt his determination growing as it has in the days after Uncle's death. I will get us safely to Kenya, he thought, no matter how hard it is. He organized the group, giving everyone a job, scavenge for food, collect firewood, stand guard while the group slept. Whatever food or water they found was shared equally among all of them. When the smaller boys grew too tired to walk, the older boys took turns carrying them on their backs. There were times when some of the boys did not want to do their share of the work. Salva would talk to them, encourage them, coax, and persuade them. Once in a while he had to speak sternly or even shout, but he tried not to do this too often. It was as if Salva's family was helping him, even though they were not there. He remembered how he had looked after his little brother Kuhl, but he also knew what it was like to have to listen to the older ones, Arik and Ring, and he could recall the gentleness of his sisters, the strength of his father, the care of his mother. Most of all, he remembered how Uncle encouraged him in the desert. One step at a time, one day at a time, just today, just this day to get through. Salva told himself this every day. He told the boys in the group too, and one day at a time the group made its way to Kenya. More than 1,200 boys arrived safely. It took them a year and a half. Questions. Describe the Gilo River crossing from start to finish. So you can talk about how Salva jumped in and started to swim, and then the boy grabbed on him and pushed him under, but that actually kept him from getting shot. And then he was able to come up and gasp for air and swim his way across. 3, where is Salva headed next, and what will he face in this part of the journey? Well, he's headed to Kenya next, and if you look on the map, and like we talked about, you can see that that means they have to walk through part of Sudan. They have to walk through some desert area again. Deserts and near mountains. It doesn't look like they had to cross any mountains. And then 4, how does Salva's role change when he joins up with this next group? Well, this time Salva becomes the leader of the group because he's one of the older boys.